In 1194, the town of Chac, France, caught fire. Most of the city burned. The cathedral was thought to be lost. But when the smoke cleared 3 days later, the townspeople found something that changed the course of medieval construction forever. The sacred relic they had stored inside, a piece of cloth said to have belonged to the Virgin Mary, survived the fire without a single scorch mark. And the medieval chroniclers recorded the reaction as unanimous. This was a sign, not just a religious sign, a mandate. Build something worthy of what had been preserved. What followed was the construction of what many architects today still cannot fully explain. A building so precisely engineered that modern acoustic scientists have spent decades trying to understand why it makes people feel the way it does. Not spiritually, physiologically. And the answer, when I finally found it, had almost nothing to do with religion. I came to this through a different door than most researchers. A friend of mine is an iologist, someone who studies how sound interacts with the human body. She mentioned offhand one afternoon that certain stone buildings, particularly the very old ones, produce frequencies that modern concert halls are specifically designed to replicate. Frequencies in a range that measurably affects heart rate, breathing, and brainwave patterns. I asked her which buildings. She named 4. 3 of them were Gothic cathedrals. The 4th was a Neolithic stone circle in Scotland. I spent the next 8 months trying to understand what connected them. What I found wasn't mysticism. It was engineering. And once I understood the engineering, I understood why the history we were given left it out entirely. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedral, meaning seat or chair. Specifically, the bishop's chair. The official history tells us cathedrals were built as expressions of religious devotion, as houses of worship, as monuments to faith. And they were all of those things, but they were also something the official history almost never mentions. They were hospitals, not in the metaphorical sense, in the direct physical documented sense. The word itself contains a clue most people walk past without noticing. The Latin root cath comes from the Greek katharin, meaning to cleanse or to purify, the same route that gives us catharsis, the emotional purging that Aristotle described when he watched tragedy in the theater. The ancient world did not separate these concepts the way we do. Purification of the body and purification of the mind were understood as the same process, achieved through the same means. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Nram, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, Salisbury, were not built by faith alone. They were built by guilds. And the guilds that built them were not simply stonecutters following a bishop's instructions. They were organizations that held knowledge which has only partially survived to the modern era. Knowledge about geometry, about acoustics, about the behavior of light through colored glass, and about how these elements combined could produce measurable effects in the human nervous system. The stonemasons who built these structures were called Freemasons, free because they worked with free stone, a fine-grained limestone or sandstone that could be cut in any direction, as opposed to the rougher rubble stone used for simpler buildings. But the freedom in that name meant something else, too. They moved between cities, between countries, carrying their technical knowledge with them, beholden to no single lord or bishop. The craft guilds of medieval Europe operated under a system of knowledge transfer that had no equivalent before or since. 7-year apprenticeships, strict standards for what could be built and how it could be priced. A body of technical knowledge passed directly person to person, generation to generation that was never fully written down. Here is what the acoustic researchers found when they started studying these buildings properly. And I want to be careful here because this is where the official story and the physical evidence diverge in ways that are difficult to ignore. The reverberation time inside Chartres Cathedral, the time it takes for a sound to decay by 60 dB after the source stops, is approximately 5 seconds. That is not unusual for a large stone building. What is unusual is the frequency distribution of that reverberation. The cathedral doesn't amplify sound equally across all frequencies. It specifically amplifies the range between 40 and 60 Hz. That is a very low frequency below the range of most musical instruments felt more than heard. It is also, according to neuroscience research published in the last 20 years, the frequency range associated with the theta state of brain activity, a state associated with deep relaxation, reduced cortisol production, and in clinical settings pain reduction. The building wasn't just beautiful, it was measurably affecting the neurochemistry of everyone inside it. Dr. Rupert Till at the University of Huddersfield has spent over a decade studying the acoustics of ancient and medieval structures. His research on Stonehenge showed that the original stone configuration would have produced standing waves that created what he calls a confusing, disorienting effect, one the ancient peoples likely understood as sacred or transformative. His work on Gothic cathedrals found similar intentional engineering. The flying buttress, which every architecture student learns, was invented to allow thinner walls and larger windows, also functions as an acoustic deflector, channeling sound waves back into the interior in ways that create the specific frequency profile these buildings produce. This was not accidental. Medieval builders did not have oscilloscopes or frequency analyzers, but they had something equally powerful. Centuries of empirical observation, generations of builders who had watched human beings respond to different stone configurations and who had refined their designs accordingly. The knowledge was held in the guild, not in any text. Now, here is where the history becomes uncomfortable. The dissolution of the monasteries in England carried out by Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 is usually taught as a religious and political event, which it was. But it was also an economic event of staggering proportions. Henry seized somewhere between a quarter and a third of all land in England. He dissolved not just the monasteries but the entire infrastructure that supported them. The craft guilds, the hospices, the almshouses, the systems of care for the sick and poor that had operated continuously for centuries. The historian Ian Duffy, in his exhaustive study of the English Reformation, documented what actually disappeared. Not just the monks, not just the religious ceremonies, the hospitals. England had approximately 500 religious hospitals operating in 1530. By 1550, fewer than 50 remained. In the space of 20 years, 90% of the existing medical infrastructure was destroyed. This is the part one keep returning to. The cathedrals and the monastic complexes were not just spiritual centers. They were the primary medical institutions of medieval Europe. The records that survived, and many were deliberately destroyed or allowed to decay, document herbal gardens that grew hundreds of medicinal species, dormitories where the sick were housed, systems for moving water through the complex for sanitation, dietary practices based on observation accumulated over generations. And at the center of the healing complex, always the cathedral itself, the building where the specific frequencies, the particular quality of light through stained glass, the geometric proportions of the nave and transept work together to produce a physiological response that modern science is only now beginning to understand. The stained glass deserves its own consideration. The official history tells us it was didactic. It told biblical stories to an illiterate population. This is true, but the glass did something else. The specific pigments used in medieval stained glass, and this is documented in material science literature, produce a light spectrum inside the building that is different from natural daylight. The red glass of Gothic cathedrals produced with copper oxide transmits light in a range that measurably affects serotonin production. The blue glass produced with cobalt transmits frequencies associated with melatonin regulation. We know this now because we have spectrometers. The medieval glaziers knew it through the same empirical observation that guided the stonemasons. They had watched human beings respond to this light for generations. They refined the recipes accordingly. But the dissolution wasn't just English. The suppression of the guilds happened across Europe over 2 centuries, accelerating through the 16th and 17th centuries as the nation-state consolidated power. The Edict of Turgot in France in 1776, just 13 years before the Revolution, abolished the guild system entirely. In England, the Statute of Artificers, which had regulated apprenticeships and wage rates since 1563, was dismantled piece by piece through the early 19th century, with the final apprenticeship clauses repealed in 1814. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made it illegal for workers to organize in collective bargaining arrangements. One by one, the legal frameworks that had allowed the guilds to operate were removed, and with them went the knowledge systems they carried. Here is the pattern that is difficult to explain away. The suppression of the guilds and the rise of industrial wage labor happened simultaneously with the transformation of what cathedrals were for. The buildings themselves didn't change, but their function did. The monastic hospitals were gone. The craft guilds that understood the acoustic and optical engineering were gone. What remained was the shell of the building pressed into service as a purely religious institution. The healing function quietly removed from the official story. By the 19th century, when historians were writing the accounts we still largely use today, the idea that a stone building could have measurable physiological effects would have seemed like superstition. They were men of the industrial age. They believed in machines and wages and observable mechanics. The idea that the medieval builders had understood something about the human nervous system that their era had lost was not a narrative that fit the story of progress. There is a man named Ion Zyderov, a Bulgarian chemist who spent 30 years researching the chemical composition of incense used in Orthodox Christian services. His findings published in a 2008 paper in the AIA-SEB journal showed that burning frankincense resin activates a protein called TIT-RPV3 in the nervous system, producing effects that are measurably anxiolytic, meaning it reduces anxiety, and analgesic, meaning it reduces pain. The church had been burning frankincense in its services for over 1,000 years before this was confirmed chemically. They didn't know about TRPV3, but they knew what happened to people who breathed it in a reverberant stone space filtered through colored light for an hour. They had been watching it happen since the cathedrals were built. I am not arguing that the medieval church was secretly a pharmaceutical company. The faith was real. The devotion was real. The belief that these effects came from the divine was genuine. What I am arguing is that the effects were also real, and that the people who designed and built these structures understood the effects empirically generation after generation and engineered them deliberately. And that understanding, the practical, transmissible, guild knowledge of how stone and glass and sound and chemistry interact to produce measurable changes in the human body was lost. Not gradually, not through neglect, through a specific sequence of legal, economic, and political acts carried out over 2 centuries, beginning with Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries and ending with the suppression of the craft guilds across Europe. The question I cannot stop asking is whether any of this was accidental. The same decades that saw the suppression of the guilds saw the first stirrings of the patent system, a legal framework that transformed knowledge from a communal guild-held resource into private property. The English Statute of Monopolies in 1624 is generally described as a landmark in intellectual property law. It was also from another angle the beginning of the legal apparatus that made it impossible to operate the way the guilds had operated, to hold knowledge collectively, to transmit it through apprenticeship, to refuse to disclose it to anyone outside the organization. The Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia refused Thomas Jefferson access to their rule book in 1817. By then, that refusal was almost nostalgic. The legal world being built around them was systematically eliminating the conditions that made such collective knowledge possible. I think about the people who built Shack. They raised a structure in 26 years that has stood for 8 centuries. The nave is 121 feet high. The walls are almost entirely glass, held in place by stone ribs and flying buttresses that still function without modern reinforcement. The building survived 2 world wars, multiple revolutions, and centuries of French weather. When modern engineers have studied it, they have found tolerances in the stonework that rival 20th century construction. The builders didn't have computers or laser levels. They had geometry passed down through the guild, practical knowledge accumulated over centuries. And they built something that measurably changed the state of every human body that entered it, through sound, through light, through chemistry, through proportions that the nervous system registers even when the conscious mind doesn't. We have lost the ability to build what they built. Not because we lack the tools. We have tools they never imagined. We have lost it because we dismantled the knowledge system that made it possible. The 7-year apprenticeship that transmitted empirical observation across generations. The guild that held the accumulated understanding of how materials behaved, how sound moved through stone, how light changed in different seasons, the connection between the builder and the building that came from a lifetime spent in both. When the guild system was dismantled and replaced with wage labor, with patents, with the factory model of production, something was lost that we haven't replaced. We can measure the frequencies inside Chartres now. We can analyze the glass with spectrometers. We can confirm that the building does what the builders intended it to do. But we cannot make another one. The knowledge of how to make another one died in the suppression of the guilds 2 centuries before we had the instruments to understand what we had lost. My iologist friend visited Chartres last year. She took a portable decibel meter and a frequency analyzer. She stood in the nave for 20 minutes measuring. Then she put down the equipment and sat in one of the wooden chairs and didn't say anything for a long time. When she came out, she said, Whatever they were doing, it works. The chair was solid and heavy and very old and still perfectly level. And the questions remain, why do the acoustic properties of a building constructed in the 12th century match the specifications that modern neurologists would design if asked to create an optimal environment for pain reduction and stress relief? Why was the knowledge of how to produce these effects held in a guild system that was systematically dismantled by the same governments that were simultaneously centralizing control over currency, land, and labor? Why do we describe the result as a church and not as what the acoustic measurements confirm it was? A machine for healing, one we don't know how to build anymore. Because we destroyed the people who knew.